The 8 thoughts appeared before the familiar 7 deadly sins. And this is an important detail, because at first, Christians were describing not a beautiful museum display of vices, but the filthy inner mechanics of a person. Not a list for a sermon on a postcard, but almost a medical chart of the soul, only without a white coat and in the desert. One of the main proponents of this theory is Evagrius Ponticus, a 4th century monk and theologian. He lived in an era when people retreated to the Egyptian desert, not for beautiful photographs against the sand, but to burn out all unnecessary things. And there, in the silence, free of crowds, markets, parties, and other people's opinions, a disturbing revelation suddenly emerged. Humans are perfectly capable of decomposing from within, even without external stimuli. Remove the noise of the world, and your brain will bring you a whole pile of garbage.
Evagrius identified 8 evil thoughts: gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, despondency, vanity, and pride. Yes, it sounds like a restaurant menu where every dish ruins your life. But for the monk, these weren't abstract character flaws, but concrete attacks on the will. A thought comes, clings to a desire, inflames it, and then the person no longer controls themselves. Very convenient. It seems like you're to blame, but it all started with a small inner whisper. Then John Cassian picked up this system. He transferred the ideas of Eastern monasticism to the Latin West, and the scheme began to spread throughout church culture. The Western tradition gained a handy tool. It could explain to people that evil rarely comes in the form of a horned monster. More often, it comes as a simple thought. Eat more. Take some for yourself. Prove you're better. Take revenge. Lie down and do nothing. Beauty. Almost the whole package.
Later, Pope Gregory I, in the 6th century, revised this system. The 8 thoughts were condensed, rearranged, and combined, gradually creating a list of the 7 deadly sins. Vanity was subsumed within pride. Sadness was linked to despondency, and envy emerged as a distinct contagion. The Church's moral accounting became more compact. The 7 points were easier to remember, easier to preach, easier to hammer into people's heads. But the old 8-thought framework is harsher and more honest. It shows not the final sin, but the moment before it. That second when a person hasn't yet committed anything terrible, but has already begun to bargain with themselves. They haven't yet stolen, but they're already cherishing the thought of someone else's wealth. They haven't yet snapped, but they're already feeding their anger. They haven't yet betrayed, but they've already explained to themselves why they can. That's why 8 thoughts are more frightening than a neat list of 7 sins. 7 sins reveal the finished monster. 8 thoughts show how it grows. In the Christian tradition, pride ranks first not because it has a pretty place on the list, but because it breaks a person at the core. The other sins at least honestly desire something concrete: food, money, a body, revenge, someone else's success. Pride desires something more terrible. It wants to place a person on an inner throne and convince them that reality must kneel before them. In the Latin tradition, it was called superbia, a dense, heavy word without any sweet psychological packaging. Not confidence, not a sense of dignity, not the ability to stand up straight under pressure. Pride begins when a person ceases to see the line between their own value and their own cult. They no longer live. They perform a constant ceremony of self-worship. Christian authors considered pride to be the root of other vices, and the logic here is uncomfortably precise. To greedily grab more than one needs, one must first decide what one is allowed. To humiliate another in anger, one must first consider oneself superior. To envy, one must consider another's success a personal violation of the cosmic order. How come this blessing wasn't mine? A systemic error. Fix it immediately. Pope Gregory I in the 6th century placed pride at the top of the vices, seeing it not simply as a bad character trait, but as an inner rebellion. Man no longer accepts his place. He refuses to be a creature, a student, a part of the world, a mortal being with limitations. No, he demands the status of center. A small body, a short life, a host of weaknesses, but a sense of self as the eternal ruler of the universe. A comedy? Yes, but with very costly consequences. The most vile thing about pride is that it can disguise itself as strength. A person appears confident, loud, and unyielding. They speak as if their every opinion has already been sealed by the heavenly office.
But beneath the surface, fear often lurks. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of appearing ordinary. Fear of admitting that someone is smarter, purer, more honest, more experienced. Pride abhors mirrors, if the mirror reveals the truth. It makes a person unteachable, and this is a nearly fatal defect. You can be weak and grow. You can be stupid and learn. You can make a mistake and correct it. But a proud person turns any remark into an attack, any advice into an insult, any rightness of another into a personal catastrophe. They don't heal the wound, they argue with the diagnosis. In theology, pride was associated with the fall of the devil, the desire to exalt oneself, to occupy a place that doesn't belong to oneself, to renounce dependence and moderation. And this is especially harsh. Pride doesn't necessarily scream. Sometimes it's very quiet. A person has simply decided within themselves that the law is not for them, truth is not for them, repentance is not for them, weakness is not for them. Pride is dangerous precisely because it doesn't look dirty. Greed reeks of predation. Lust betrays itself as hunger. Anger immediately makes noise. But pride can stand in clean clothes, speak intelligently, and even discuss morality. Only somehow, at the center of this morality, the same character always ends up. The person himself, his greatness, his resentment, his exceptionalism. And when such a structure falls, it falls with a bang. Because reality didn't sign a contract to serve someone else's ego. It simply comes and shows, you're not God. Not the sinner, not the final authority. You're a human being. And if this revelation feels humiliating, it means pride has been lurking within for a long time, quietly eating away at you from the inside. Envy appears quiet on the list of deadly sins, almost intelligent, without shouting, without bloodshed, without obvious madness. But that's precisely why it's vile. It doesn't always push a person to steal, hit, or betray right away. No. It first settles inside and begins to whisper. Someone else's joy insults you. Someone else's success humiliates you. Someone else's gift feels as if it was stolen from your own pocket. In the Latin tradition, envy was called invidia. The meaning is crude and precise, looking at another's good fortune with diseased eyes. A person sees that another has beauty, power, money, talent, respect, love, and instead of a normal reaction, a little judge with a rotten gavel kicks in. Why him? Why her? Am I worse? And so the world turns into a dirty competition, where any happiness of another is perceived as a personal defeat. Christian authors considered envy particularly dangerous because it hates not evil, but good. That's the poison. The greedy at least want something. The glutton wants pleasure. The angry want to crush the enemy. The envious want to see others worse off. Sometimes they don't even need to get the same thing. It's enough for them to see someone else's joy fade. Magnificent. A person doesn't build a house for themselves. They dream of their neighbor's roof collapsing. Thomas Aquinas wrote of envy as grief over another's good. It's a dry formulation, but within it lies a genuine psychological horror. The envious person suffers not from poverty, hunger, or disaster. They suffer because someone else is doing well. In other words, reality may be quite bearable, but the brain itself turns on the torment factory and begins to produce pain from someone else's success. Envy almost always disguises itself as justice. It rarely says honestly, "I can't stand that you're lucky." It puts on a respectable mask and mutters, "The world is simply unfair. It's simply overrated. It's simply that she didn't deserve it. It's simply that they helped him." Of course. Very convenient. You don't have to work on yourself. Don't acknowledge the work of others. Don't look at your own emptiness. It's enough to declare someone else's victory a mistake. In religious logic,
Envy corrodes love for one's neighbor, because one's neighbor ceases to be human. They become irritating proof of one's inferiority. Their talent no longer inspires. Their success no longer brings joy. One wants to diminish their happiness, devalue it, tarnish it. And so the soul becomes a windowless room, constantly compared, judged, suspected, and quietly hated. The most pathetic thing about envy is that it rarely brings benefits. It doesn't make a person richer. It doesn't make them more beautiful. It doesn't make them smarter. It simply burns up attention that could be spent on growth. While one is building, the other is watching and seething. While one is learning, the other is explaining to themselves why everything is unfair.
A brilliant strategy: to sit in your own poison and wait for someone else to be poisoned by it. Envy is fatal not because a person compares themselves to another just once. Everyone does. It becomes a sin when comparison becomes a way of life, when someone else's goodness seems a threat, when someone else's joy feels like they should be punished. And then a person no longer simply looks at someone else's light. They do everything they can to make their own mind darker. Anger takes the place of inner fire on the list of deadly sins, which a person first calls justice, then character, then principles, and then stands among the rubble and pretends it all happened on its own. Convenient. Very human. First you rage. Then you allow yourself to strike with a word. Then with an action. Then with the fate of another person, if you have the power. In the Latin tradition, this sin was called ira. It's not a simple flash of irritation, not a brief signal from the body that boundaries have been violated. We're talking about rage, which a person cultivates like a caged predator, feeds it, caresses it, releases it when the urge to punish begins. And that's where the real filth begins, because anger can pretend to be noble. It rarely says, "I want to destroy." It says, "I restore justice." Christian authors didn't deny that anger can have a cause. The Bible suggests that one can be angry and not sin. In other words, the emotion itself doesn't make a person a monster. The problem begins when anger ceases to be a signal and becomes a rudder. A person no longer reacts to evil, they relish the opportunity to be cruel. That's the fine line. First, you defend the truth. Then, you simply enjoy the pressure. The monks of the early church had an unromantic view of anger. For them, it was one of those evil thoughts that cloud the mind. Evagrius Ponticus wrote of passions as forces that overwhelm the mind. And anger fits this description perfectly. It narrows the world to a single point: the offender, the enemy, the guilty party. Everything else disappears. Mercy, later. Reason, silent. Responsibility, closed for renovation. The most vile thing about anger is that it gives a person a sense of power. For a while. You speak louder. You move more abruptly. It feels like an engine has started inside. But it's cheap fuel. It quickly burns through control and then leaves behind fatigue, shame, and the consequences. The words have already been spoken. The doors have already slammed. The person has already been humiliated. And try to explain later that you were simply out of your mind. A wonderful formula for an adult. The body has grown. There are no brakes. Anger is especially dangerous when combined with pride. Then a person is no longer simply angry. They believe they have the right to punish. Their pain becomes law. Their resentment becomes judgment. Their voice becomes a hammer. In such a state, people destroy families, friendships, communities, and nations. Not necessarily with weapons. Sometimes the tongue is enough. The tongue is a small organ, but it wreaks destruction like a heavy machine. In medieval moralism, anger was associated with revenge, hatred, and the desire to harm. And this is more honest than the modern soft-spoken argument about temperament. Temperament conveniently justifies everything: shouting, humiliation, threats, the cold, silent reprisal. But mortal sin doesn't begin where a person feels the heat. It begins where a person decides that this heat gives them license to inflict pain. Anger isn't scary because it's loud.
A loud person is at least noticeable. More frightening is anger that's quiet, controlled, carefully packaged into plans. When a person doesn't explode, but stores up their rage, polishes it, chooses the right moment, that's no longer an emotion. That's a workshop of harm. And here's the final nastiness. Anger almost always promises relief. Now I'll tell you. Now I'll punish you. Now I'll restore balance. And then there's no balance. There's just another layer of ash inside. Because rage doesn't heal pain well. It simply spreads it around, like an infected file, and the person proudly presses send. Laziness sounds almost comical on a list of deadly sins, as if we're talking about someone who likes to lie around, takes a long time to wake up, and too often promises to start a new life tomorrow. But the old Christian tradition spoke of something far more unpleasant, not about a soft blanket and post-work fatigue. Laziness was defined there as spiritual apathy, an inner refusal to live life to its fullest potential. When a person sees what they must do, understands where they must go, and still chooses to slowly decay in place. Early monks called this state despondency, or acedia. Evagrius Ponticus, in the 4th century, considered it one of the 8 evil thoughts. And here's where things get interesting. A monk in the desert had no usual excuses, no bustling city, no endless entertainment, no crowds to blame for his own emptiness, only silence, heat, prayer, work, and your own head. And your head suddenly says, enough, give it up, everything is pointless, nothing changes, a stunning inner saboteur. John Cassian described this as a state in which a person becomes disgusted with their place, their work, their duty. They look at their life and begin to mentally ache inside. This is bad. It would be better there. These people are getting in the way. This work is boring. This path is too long. A classic. Don't change yourself, but declare the entire world around you unsuitable. Later, when the Western tradition compiled a list of the 7 deadly sins, laziness became broader. It began to be understood as a refusal of spiritual labor, of responsibility, of love, of normal progress toward goodness. And this is no longer about rest. Humans need rest. Even the body is not a machine, although some stubbornly try to live as if spare parts were in the next drawer. Sin begins when rest turns into escape, and pause becomes a way of life. Laziness is insidious because it rarely looks like a crime. The greedy grab, the angry yell, the envious look venomously at someone else's joy, but the lazy simply do nothing, quietly, carefully, without blood on their hands. Only later does it become clear that their inaction is also destructive. Didn't say the right word, didn't help, didn't fix, didn't protect, didn't grow, didn't show up, didn't do anything. Small voids add up to a huge hole, and a person still wonders why life has become like an abandoned building. The most pathetic thing about laziness is that it likes to sound reasonable. I'm not ready. It's not the time. I need to think. I'll start later. First, I'll get myself together. The person doesn't refuse outright. They simply postpone life indefinitely. Very convenient. No tragedy today, just quiet capitulation every day. In Christian logic, laziness is fatal because it kills the ability to respond to a calling. God, conscience, duty, love, talent, and one's neighbor demand movement. But laziness responds later. And this can last for years until a person discovers they haven't rested, haven't conserved their strength, haven't waited for the right moment. They've simply been voluntarily surrendering their life, piece by piece. Greed, listed among the deadly sins, sounds too mundane, as if someone simply loves money, hoards things, and nervously checks their account. But in the Christian tradition, it's about a deeper breakdown. Greed begins when possessions cease to serve life and become a small idol in themselves. A person no longer uses money, power, or resources. They serve them.
voluntarily.
With the zeal of a slave who is also proud of his chains. In the Latin tradition, this sin was called avaritia. Early ascetics had a similar category, avarice, the love of money. Not just practicality, not prudence, not the desire to feed a family and not die in poverty. Avarice begins when a person turns accumulation into a religion without a temple. There is no prayer, but there is constant counting. How much do I have? How much does someone else have? How much more can I squeeze out? Where does the profit lie? Who can I push aside? Medieval theologians saw the danger in greed not because coins themselves were evil. Metal isn't to blame. Paper isn't to blame. Numbers on a screen don't wake up in the morning with plans to destroy your soul. The problem lies in the person who begins to believe that security, dignity, and meaning can be bought, folded, hidden, and guarded until death. A brilliant idea.
Especially considering that death comes without regard for bank accounts. Greed is insatiable by design. It has no normal stopping point. A person gets more and almost immediately stops feeling more. The bar shifts. Yesterday, one level would have been enough. Today, the next one is needed. Tomorrow, it's shameful to have less than those whom they've set as their own measure of success. And so the brain turns into a calculating machine with an anxious motor inside. Thomas Aquinas attributed greed to an excessive desire for external goods. That's a very dry way of putting it. But in human terms, it looks like this. For the sake of things that were supposed to help one live, one begins to ruin one's life itself. One deceives. One restrains. One pressures. One bargains with one's conscience. At first, just a little. Then, more boldly. Then, it becomes so habitual, as if morality were a temporary subscription whose expiration date had passed.
The most vile thing about greed is that it can sound reasonable. I'm just thinking about the future. I'm just taking what's mine. I just don't want to be weak. Of course. It's a beautiful mask. Beneath it, fear often lurks. Fear of lack, fear of dependence, fear of being ordinary and vulnerable. But fear doesn't justify turning other people into stepping stones, wallets, tools, and consumables. Greed is deadly because it dries a person up from the inside. Love becomes an expense. Compassion seems like a loss. Honesty seems like a bad strategy. And a loved one becomes an obstacle between you and the next dose of control. And the more a greedy person grabs, the more they fear losing. That's the whole point of luxury. More possessions, less freedom. More security, less peace. Greed promises a person fullness. In reality, it turns them into an empty warehouse with a guard at the entrance. Anything could be inside. Money, positions, influence, rare items. But if a person has forgotten why they need it all, they are no longer the owner. They are the guardian of their own cage. Gluttony, in the list of mortal sins, is often reduced to someone who eats too much, and with that, the idea dies. Very convenient. They turned an ancient vice into a caricature of a full plate, laughed at it, and moved on. But the Christian tradition spoke about more than just portion size. It spoke of the power of appetite over a person. It spoke of the moment when the body no longer asks for what it needs, but commands, demands, acts capriciously, and drags the will along with it, like a bad master dragging an animal on a chain. For the early ascetics, this sin was among the 8 evil thoughts. Evagrius Ponticus called it one of the monks' first enemies, and not because monks hated food. They understood perfectly well. Without food, a person does not pray, does not work, does not think, but simply falls. The question was different. Who rules whom? Do people eat to live, or do they live to serve their mouth, stomach, and the eternal inner cry? A little more delicious, more right now. In the Latin tradition, gluttony was called gula, a short word, almost a gulp, and its meaning is unpleasantly broad. It's not just about quantity, but about the dependence on the pleasure of consumption. You can eat too much. You can eat too greedily. You can make a cult of taste. You can turn an ordinary meal into a small ceremony of self-worship. Funny? Only until you discover that your day revolves around the next dose of pleasure. Medieval theologians saw gluttony as a spiritual problem. Appetite itself is normal. Hunger is normal. The joy of food is normal. Yes, religion didn't demand that people hate bread, water, and a proper dinner. The trouble began when desire became the master. People already understand that enough is enough, but they continue to indulge. They already see the limits, but they disdain them.
They already know they're giving in to weakness, and yet they bargain with themselves anyway, like a cheap lawyer for their own debauchery.
Gluttony is insidious because it appears to be a soft sin. Didn't kill, didn't steal, didn't betray, simply took too much, simply indulged, simply relaxed. But that's how decay works, rarely with fanfare, more often with little permission. Today you can't say no to a plate. Tomorrow you can't say no to a desire. Then any pleasure demands immediate service, while the will sits in the corner, pretending it wasn't invited. In Christian logic, gluttony is also dangerous because it teaches a person to value comfort above meaning. I want it now. I want it more pleasantly. I want it without effort. And this formula easily migrates from the kitchen to the rest of life, to entertainment, to shopping, to sexual desires, to the endless consumption of images, sounds, news, and other people's lives.
The mouth is replaced by a screen, the plate by a stream of pleasures. But the essence is the same. A person fills the inner emptiness with something that quickly gives taste and quickly disappears. The most pathetic thing about gluttony is that it promises satiation, but cultivates insatiability. The more often a person gives in to every impulse, the less they tolerate boundaries. Moderation begins to seem like an enemy. Abstinence seems like punishment. Any pause feels like self-abuse. Congratulations, appetite has been enthroned, and a person has become the courtier of their own desires. Gluttony is not mortal because of food. Food is only the first door. Behind it lies a great and ancient question. Is a person capable of self-control when pleasure lies before them? Or is the smell, the taste, the comfort, the soft promise of pleasure enough, and all their great spirituality crumbles like thin paper in the rain?
Lust, on the list of deadly sins, begins not with desire itself, but from the moment when desire grabs a person by the throat and drags them wherever it pleases. The Christian tradition has never claimed that the body itself is dirty. Everyone has a body. Desire, too. The problem begins when the other person ceases to be a person and becomes an object, a surface, a way to quickly quench an inner itch. In the Latin tradition, lust was called luxuria. The word connotes excess, debauchery, desire growing beyond measure. Not love, not intimacy, not the normal human desire for another. Lust lives in a simpler, more blunt way. I want, I take, I'm sated, and I move on. A very mature program. Almost like a hungry beast, only at least the beast doesn't pretend to be a philosopher. Early Christian ascetics included lust among the evil thoughts. Evagrius Ponticus saw it as one of the forces that clog the mind with images, fantasies, and inner noise. A person might seem to be sitting quietly, undisturbed, but within, a whole marketplace of desires is already underway. Thought clings to an image. The image inflames passion. Passion demands action. And the will begins to bargain. Just a little more. Just look. Just imagine. Just allow yourself. Church writers feared lust not because of a panic over the body, but because of its ability to disrupt the order of love. It replaces connection with consumption. Where responsibility should be, lust appears. Where respect should be, exploitation appears. Where a person should see another person as a whole, they see only what can be taken for pleasure. Beauty. A person with a soul, history, pain, and freedom is transformed into a convenient tool. Lust is often disguised as romance. They say passion is stronger than rules. The heart demands it. Life is short. Yes, of course. Convenient phrases for those who want their conscience to leave the room and lock the door from the outside.
But the old morality took a more straightforward approach. If desire compels one to lie, betray, humiliate, buy a body, destroy a family, exploit another's weakness, then it's no longer a feeling. It's a little dictator in a pretty mask. The most dangerous thing about lust is that it promises freedom, but makes a person dependent. More images, more stimuli, more novelty, more rights to someone else's body and attention. And the more often a person gives in, the worse they tolerate rejection, boundaries, fidelity, silence. Desire grows, but the person shrinks. Lust is deadly because it teaches us to view living people as objects. And when a person gets used to using another for their own pleasure, they're not just breaking a rule, they're corrupting the very capacity to love. That's when the real catastrophe begins. Without thunder, without fire. Love is simply replaced within a person with hunger.
Vanity, in the history of mortal sins, stands next to pride, like its more elegant and more nervous relative. Pride says, I am above all. Vanity says, look at me, affirm me, admire me. Otherwise, I will begin to fall apart. Such is the luxurious construction. A person seems to live, breathe, think, but inside there is a cash register where others must constantly deposit their approval. Early Christian authors often called vanity, vanity. In the Latin tradition, it's vana gloria, empty glory, a very accurate term. Glory exists, but the content is questionable. There's sound, but no weight. A person doesn't want to become kind, wise, honest, or strong, but to appear that way in the eyes of others. That can be true later. The main thing is to be noticed now. Evagrius Ponticus included vanity among the 8 evil thoughts, and monks understood perfectly well why this was dangerous. Even in the desert, where there seemed to be no crowds, a person could mentally construct a scene. How humble I am. How strict. How spiritual. Amazing. Even a struggle with the ego can be turned into an advertisement for the ego. The human psyche is generally adept at doing dirty work with white gloves. Vanity is different from the simple desire to look normal. It's normal to want clean clothes, to be treated with respect, to have a good reputation. The problem begins when outward appearance becomes more important than inner state. A person doesn't correct their character, they polish a facade. They don't fix rot, but paint over the cracks. Nobility on the outside, but a hungry demand within. Tell me I'm important. Later, when the Western church tradition condensed the 8 thoughts into 7 deadly sins, vanity was often swallowed up by pride. The logic is clear. Both vices revolve around an inflated ego. But vanity deserves a separate discussion, because it doesn't always appear powerful. Sometimes it's pitiful. A person depends on the eyes of others as on oxygen. One day without praise, and their entire inner empire begins to crumble. The most insidious thing about vanity is that it can disguise itself as virtue. A person does good, but in a way that everyone can see. They talk about modesty, but expect applause for it. They help, but mentally check to see who noticed. Yeah, right. Even compassion can be turned into window dressing if there's a hunger for recognition deep down inside. In Christian logic, vanity is deadly because it replaces truth with image. A person no longer asks, "Who have I become?" They ask, "How do I look?" And this is a terrible substitution. Because an image can be customized. You can speak the right words, wear the right face, show the right gestures. But inside, you remain empty, angry, cowardly, cold. But if the audience applauds, vanity is satisfied. Vanity promises a person radiance, but makes them dependent on the light of others. They don't stand on their own. They are supported by glances, likes, praise, status, admiration. Remove the audience, and the crown suddenly turns into a cheap headband. This is why vanity is so dangerous. It doesn't just crave attention. It teaches a person to live not before conscience and God, but before an audience that will forget their name tomorrow. In the history of mortal sins, despondency is far darker than the usual bad news, fatigue, or a difficult day. In the early Christian tradition, it was called acedia, a word that struck not at a person's mood, but at a person's very ability to live meaningfully. Not the sadness of loss, not an understandable pain. Despondency began when a person turned away from meaning and quietly consented to becoming empty. In the 4th century, Evagrius Ponticus included despondency among the 8 evil thoughts. For desert monks, it was a particularly dangerous enemy, because it came not with noise, but with a viscous internal nausea.
The monk looked at his cell, at his prayer, at his work, at his own path, and everything suddenly seemed dead, useless, boring, foreign, as if life had been switched off, but the body still moved on out of habit. John Cassian wrote of this state almost as an attack on the will. A person loses their passion for their work, becomes irritated by the place where they are, dreams of escaping anywhere, just to avoid facing themselves. This is a particularly nasty thing. Despondency often convinces a person that the problem is somewhere outside. The wrong job, the wrong people, the wrong city, the wrong day. But inside, the old, sticky thought lingers. Nothing has any weight. Nothing is worth the effort. In the Western tradition, despondency has gradually become linked to laziness. Pope Gregory I, when reorganizing his list of vices, linked this inner deadness with the rejection of spiritual labor. But despondency is broader and more frightening. The lazy may simply not want to do anything. The despondent no longer believes that there is any point in doing anything. The difference is unpleasant. One lies dormant, the other has already canceled the future within. Christian authors didn't confuse despondency with normal human grief. Sadness can be an honest reaction to evil, death, betrayal, loss. There's truth in it. Despondency, however, begins to gnaw at hope itself. It says, don't get up. Don't ask for help. Don't change. Don't love. Don't start. It won't work anyway. A very convenient internal executioner who doesn't get his hands dirty because the person himself stops moving. The worst thing about despondency is that it seems reasonable. Like, I'm just looking at life soberly. I'm just not fooling myself. I just understand how things work. Yes, of course. Often, this isn't wisdom, but capitulation dressed up as cold philosophy. A person declares the world empty so as not to take responsibility for their own fear, pain, and inaction. Despondency is fatal because it shuts off love, duty, and hope all at once. A person no longer rebels, no longer fights, no longer asks, no longer builds. They settle. They become heavy for themselves and cold to others. And this is a terribly quiet sin, without scandal, without rage, without the greedy crunching of coins. Day after day, the soul simply refuses to rise. Resentment isn't included as a separate item in the classic list of deadly sins, and that's where things get interesting. Technically, it can be hidden within anger, envy, and pride. But in reality, resentment deserves its own storage unit, because people know how to store old pain there, cherish it, revisit it, polish it, and call it memory. Very convenient. Not to heal the wound, but to reopen it on schedule. In Christian logic, resentment is dangerous because it turns the evil of the past into a permanent resident within a person. Someone humiliated you. Someone betrayed you. Someone didn't appreciate you. Someone said something that should have been long ago let go. But no, why bother? It's better to carry it inside for years, like a document of eternal accusation. A person becomes an archivist of someone else's guilt, and simultaneously, a prisoner of their own archive. Resentment almost always disguises itself as justice. It doesn't say,
I want to suffer and torment myself with the memory. It says, I simply haven't forgotten. I simply drew conclusions. I simply won't allow it anymore. And some of that may be true. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone else to ruin your life again. But resentment is more cunning. It doesn't protect boundaries. It builds an internal prison around a person and hands them a key they refuse to use. The Holy Fathers wrote about remembrance of rancor, that is, the hoarding of evil in one's memory. The word is harsh, but precise. Not simply the memory of a fact, but the hoarding of evil, as if there were a separate compartment for poison within. A person takes a past offense, pulls it out, tastes it, gets angry again, and once again proves to themselves that they were right. A beautiful pattern. The enemy has already left. The situation is over, and the person continues to serve the conflict alone. The most pathetic thing about resentment is that it often gives a sense of moral superiority. I suffered, so I'm superior. I was hurt, so now I have the right to be cold, harsh, vindictive, and withdrawn. This is how pain turns into permission to self-destruct. A brilliant trade-off. You were wronged once, and then you inflict it on yourself every day to prove that person wrong. Resentment feeds anger like dry grass feeds fire. It revives old scenes, adds new details, amplifies someone else's guilt, and erases one's own blindness. After a while, a person no longer remembers the event, but a retouched version, in which they are always pure, the other person is always a monster, and reality, for some reason, is obligated to compensate for the internal damage. Spiritually, resentment is deadly because it blocks compassion. A person no longer sees another person before them, a living being who is weak, complex, and fallible. They see only the debtor. The debtor must acknowledge, pay, suffer, understand, and feel compassion. And until this happens, the offended person seems to put their own life on hold. Magnificent. To surrender control of your soul to someone you hate. Resentment doesn't always scream. More often, it's silent. It hardens. It smiles in your face. It speaks in a calm voice, but inside, it keeps a list. And the longer a person keeps it, the less freedom they have. Because the past is already in the past, and they still sit there, in the old room, with the lights off, guarding the pain that has long since become their personal idol. Intolerance, when discussing mortal sins, isn't specifically listed among the classic 7, but rather lives quietly within pride, anger, and spiritual blindness. This is the case when a person doesn't simply hold convictions, but rather turns them into a cudgel. They no longer say, I think this. They say, everyone who thinks differently must disappear, shut up, or immediately become a convenient copy of me. In the Christian tradition, the root of such intolerance usually lies in pride. People place themselves in the place of judge, as if they've been given a personal seal of absolute truth. They no longer distinguish between firmness of faith and hatred of others' differences. These are two different things. The first requires inner discipline. The second requires only an inflated ego and a desire to control others' lives. Intolerance often disguises itself as a concern for order. They say, I'm defending the truth. I'm fighting error. I'm preventing the world from falling apart. It sounds respectable, almost noble. Only later does it become clear that beneath this beautiful cloak lies a simple thirst for power. It's not enough for a person to live by their own rules. They need everyone else to follow their own internal rules, like a guarded corridor. Medieval Christian thought spoke much about the sins of the tongue, judgment, pride, and hatred. Intolerance is perfectly woven from these details. First, a person condemns. Then they despise. Then they stop seeing the other person as an individual. They no longer see a living person with fears, mistakes, experience, and a conscience, but a label. Convenient. A label doesn't need to be understood. It can simply be torn off, thrown away, trampled. The most vile thing about intolerance is that it kills the capacity for mercy, yet often calls itself morality. A person may speak of goodness, faith, purity, tradition, and justice, but inside, the pleasure of punishment simmers, and that's where the mask falls. If your righteousness demands that another be humiliated, crushed, and deprived of a voice, perhaps you're no longer serving the truth. You're serving your own anger. Intolerance is especially dangerous in a crowd. A single hard-hearted person is unpleasant. A crowd of such people becomes a machine. This has been repeated many times in the history of religions, states, and ideologies. First, someone else's opinion is labeled a threat. Then the other group is declared dirty. Then violence is explained as necessary. People become surprisingly cruel quickly when they are allowed to consider cruelty a virtue. In a spiritual sense, intolerance is deadly because it blinds a person to repentance. They always look outward.
There are the guilty, there are the corrupt, there are the wrong.
And inside, of course, is a temple of purity and infallibility, a beautiful illusion. The louder a person hunts for the sins of others, the less they notice their own rottenness beneath their feet. Intolerance isn't born of strength. More often, it's born of fear. Fear of the world's complexity, of the freedom of others, of the fact that truth can require not only shouting, but also patience, humility, and effort. And that's more difficult. Shouting is easier. Forbidding is easier. Hating is easier. That's why intolerance is so convenient. It gives a person a sense of rightness without true depth, and a sense of power without true love.